But now I want your calls on this. Can William, that's Prince William, save the monarchy? 0207 862 2222 is the number that you need to give us a ring. In a new BBC documentary, veteran broadcaster David Dimbleby has been investigating attitudes to the royal family. Now, he's asked whether Prince William's so-called ordinary Joe approach could actually win back more support for the monarchy. From his love of Aston Villa, the football club, to zipping around Windsor Castle on an e-scooter, has the prince convinced you that he actually connects with ordinary people? Or no matter what, and no matter what he does, do you believe that monarchy has just simply had its day? Wilfred.
I hope monarchy hasn't had his day, but I do believe he's got a big challenge on his hands, because with all of this Prince Andrew debacle, there's a long way they've got to go to win back the trust. Now, I don't know whether I see him as your ordinary Joe, so it's quite an interesting description.
Well, I think perhaps sort of more relatable, right? Less distant with the public.
You know, I go back to Princess Di. She was relatable to all sorts of people, and no one yet has her magic. And I think it's someone like that, or learning what she did, which I think is going to connect with the public. You know, going around on e-scooters and that sort of stuff, I don't think is enough, really. You need to go a step further, like Princess Di did. She really, you know, reached out in terms of being one of the first people to be seen touching people with AIDS, going out to Africa and walking through lion mines. I mean, she was bold. That's how you're going to bring about change, and that's when you're going to be seen as relatable.
I mean, he says, Yasmin, he's all about change. He says, I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda, not overtly radical, but changes that I think must happen. He also said, look, I look at tradition, he said, and I look at some tradition and I ask myself, is it still fit for purpose today?
No, they're working really hard to create this mirage, okay? There's a fantastic new book out by Norman Baker, who was the ex-Lib Dem MP, and he's looked at their finances. It's appalling how much they're ripping us off. Appalling. Truly, even I, who am anti-monarchist, never knew the figures that Norman Baker's put into his book. I can't remember the title of the book. It just came out 2 weeks ago. And the idea that he will now be slightly unshaven and mix with the football crowds and pretend to be ordinary old Joe is just not going to wash. And you know what? I said in my column in The Eye this last week, Andrew is a really good scapegoat for them. With everybody hating Andrew so much, they're not looking at them. And David Dimbleby, in his words, you know, he comes from a very establishment family. He said, Charles and William are sitting on a fortune and they must pay taxes. So things are shifting, and I'm really pleased they are.
But perhaps that's some of the change that William is talking about.
No, he hasn't said that.
Well,
he hasn't said that.
We don't know what he said. Okay, but let me ask you this then. If he turned around and said, look, the amount of wealth me and my family have amassed is obscene or too large, I think we should come forward and contribute more to the public purse. If he said that, would you change your mind?
No, I wouldn't, because it's all about inequality at a really deep level now. But a year ago, we had a Channel 4 program which showed us how the two duchies were ripping off the state.
Well, that's when they were leasing buildings.
£800,000 for a shed for an ambulance to the You know, William has had a year. Has he done anything?
Okay.
No.
I put a great value in being here, but with all brands, what you have to do is that you've got to constantly refresh to be relevant. And this is the challenge that he now has. Unless he refreshes, we will have a lot more views like Yasmin saying they're no longer relevant.
Okay.
If he really cared about the nation, after last year's documentary, he would have gone to his duchy and sorted this exploitation out. He hasn't done that. I'm sure it's very pleasant when you meet him. That's what they're trained to be as they grow up. And I do agree with Wilfred that Diana had that extraordinary touch. And look what they did to her. When do you ever get a really honest, thank God for Channel 4 and thank God for actually David Dimbleby, because he's coming out with things that they should be paying taxes. But we've never had anything but this drip, drip, drip of...
But the thing is, I asked you earlier, and you said even if they do pay the taxes, you still want to see them gone.
Yeah, because I think, for me, I have always believed that in a democracy, every child born is of equal value to every other child. When a royal child is born and we're expected to think that child as more than the other humans of this kingdom, we're not a democracy.
Let's squeeze in James. Let's squeeze in James from Shropshire. James, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Sorry, we've got just under a minute left, but what would you like to say, James?
Hello, Alexa. Yeah,
Hi.
thanks for having me on. Yes, well, after QE2, I thought to myself, now is the time. It's a medieval system, let's get rid of it.
Yeah.
William and Kate should put a stop to this system now and fly off to the sun with their children. I have read the Norman Baker book, which Yasmin mentioned, and people often say, well, it attracts loads of visitors here in the UK, and I say, no, it doesn't. More people visit France than any other country in the world.
Yes.
And they did exactly what we should have done in 1795, behead the monarchy.
Family, sit down for this one, because I just watched a British lunchtime panel accidentally build the strongest case for Prince Harry that I have heard on mainstream UK television in years. And the wild part? Not one person on that panel was trying to defend him. They were talking about William, they were talking about e-scooters and Aston Villa shirts, and whether the future king can convince the public he's one of them. But by the time the segment wrapped, they had walked themselves into a truth the Palace Communications Office has spent 5 years trying to bury. The thing they're all searching for in William already exists. It's just standing on the wrong side of the Atlantic. Let's start with the moment that actually mattered, because it flew past fast, and I don't think the panel even clocked what they'd said. One of the commentators wasn't arguing that William is a bad person. Nobody said that. What he said was more specific and honestly more damning. William doesn't have the magic. And then he did something almost nobody on royal telly is willing to do on camera. He went straight to Diana. He pointed out that in nearly 3 decades, nobody in that family, not William, not Kate, not the institution as a machine, has ever replicated what Diana did without trying. She sat with AIDS patients when politicians were still terrified to shake their hands on camera. She walked through a live minefield in Angola in a flak jacket, not for a photo op, but because she wanted the world to see what these weapons actually do to people after the cameras usually look away. She didn't manufacture closeness to ordinary people. She had it. And the public, being far less stupid than palace strategists give them credit for, could always tell the difference between a woman who felt something and an institution that was performing feeling for ratings. That distinction, felt versus performed, is the whole ball game, squaddies. And once you set that bar, there's only one working royal alive today who clears it. It's not William, it's Harry. Because here's what the panel didn't spell out, so I will. Harry didn't pick up empathy in a media training session at Kensington Palace. He absorbed it as a child, watching his mother do exactly what that commentator just described, in real time, before he was old enough to understand it was extraordinary. And then he spent his adult life turning that inheritance into action instead of leaving it in a memory box. Invictus Games exists because Harry watched wounded servicemen suffering in silence and decided silence wasn't good enough. His mental health advocacy, the same advocacy British tabloids mocked as soft and self-indulgent back in 2019, is now being treated as basic common sense in 2026. He wasn't early. The tabloids were just wrong, loudly in print, for years. Harry doesn't have to connect with ordinary people as a strategic pivot, the way William's team is currently trying to engineer with a scooter and an unshaven jaw. Harry grew up in the house of the woman who invented that kind of connection. He didn't learn the performance, he inherited the instinct. Now, let's talk about William's side of this, because the panel's other commentator dismantled it far more bluntly than the no magic line did. And this is where it gets financial, family, which means this is where it gets real. Her argument wasn't really about scooters at all. It was about money. She referenced a new book digging into royal finances, and here's the detail I need you to sit with. She is, by her own description, no fan of the monarchy, someone who has covered these finances for years, and she said she was still shocked by what she found. An £800,000 shed leased out to the ambulance service. Duchy income structures that a Channel 4 documentary already dragged into the light once before. And a full year after that documentary aired, William hasn't touched a single one of those structures, despite having, in her words, the power to. That's the real headline the palace does not want trending. Not is William relatable, but is William honest about the gap between the image he's selling and the income he's protecting? And right now, both the panel and the paperwork are answering that question the same way. No. Here's where I want every squaddy watching to really lean in, because this is the part that gets buried every single time. When Harry and Meghan stepped back in 2020, the loudest accusation thrown at them was abandonment of duty. Remember that? How dare they? But listen to what's being argued on British television in 2026, that staying inside an institution, drawing public funds, and refusing to reform your own finances for a full year is itself a failure of duty. Flip that logic around, and it doesn't flatter the people who stayed. It vindicates the ones who left. Archewell, Invictus. Meghan's now Emmy-nominated work on With Love, Meghan. That's not retreat. That's exactly what the commentator on that panel said William has failed to do. Refresh, evolve, prove you're still relevant. Harry and Meghan did it, self-funded, outside the system, while being mocked for leaving it. And then a caller phoned in and said the quiet part loudest of all, that the whole structure is outdated and should be scrapped the way France scrapped its monarchy over 2 centuries ago. I'm not here to relitigate Republic versus monarchy today, but notice the question that caller's argument actually forces onto the table. If this institution survives at all, who inside that family has genuine public trust to carry it forward? And on that question, global polling isn't ambiguous. Harry and Meghan's popularity in the US, across the Commonwealth, with younger audiences everywhere, dwarfs anything William and Kate register once you step outside UK borders. That's not spin, family. That's the same magic the commentator said nobody has replicated, except somebody has. He's just been pushed out of the building. Let's go back to the scooter for a second, because I think the panel let William off far too easy by calling it clumsy. The e-scooter, the Aston Villa shirt, the deliberately unshaven look, that's not clumsiness. That's a communications team sitting in a room at Kensington Palace deciding the fastest route back to public affection is cosplay. A future king performing casualness while the financial architecture underneath him stays exactly as opaque as it was before the cameras rolled. That is the identical playbook that's been weaponized against Meghan and Harry for years. Control the visual, let the image carry the story so nobody asks about the substance. Except when Meghan wore a nice dress, it was tone deaf. When Harry smiled in the wrong photo, it was out of touch. William rides a scooter around Windsor while his duchy rents a shed to the NHS for the better part of £1 million. And somehow that's relatable. Sit with that double standard, because it is not subtle once you see it. On the finances specifically, I want to slow down on this because I don't think people appreciate how big of an admission it is when a royal correspondent who has spent years covering the Crown estate says she's still finding things that shock her. That's not a minor detail. That is someone whose entire career is built on knowing this institution, telling you on air that the opacity isn't an accident. It's structural. It's the design. And here's the thread I want you to actually connect, family, because this is the whole point of today's video. This exact culture, protect the institution's finances, protect its image, and if a scandal needs a lightning rod, point the cameras at whoever's most disposable, whether that's Andrew or Meghan or Harry, is precisely the system Harry has spent years testifying about in British courtrooms. His legal battles against tabloid publishers were never a side plot. They are the same story the panel just admitted to on daytime television, that a press ecosystem exists in part to protect the institution by sacrificing individuals inside it. One of the panelists even said, almost as an aside, that everyone piling on Andrew means nobody's actually looking at them, meaning the institution itself. That's not me saying it. That's a mainstream commentator confirming in 2026 exactly what Harry has been saying publicly since 2020. Look at what Harry's actually doing this year away from any courtroom. Well Child, supporting seriously ill children and their families. Scotty's Little Soldiers, supporting bereaved military kids. Nobody built a viral campaign around those visits. He shows up because, as the panel said of his mother, it's instinct, not strategy. And then there's Invictus, with the Birmingham 2027 launch approaching. If you've heard Harry talk about that event even once, you know it isn't a side hustle. It's Diana's Angola minefield translated into an institution he built himself, funded largely outside the Crown's own budget. The exact budget the panel spent the segment criticising. And Meghan's Emmy nomination for With Love, Meghan deserves more airtime in this conversation than it's getting, because it's living proof of the very principle the panel raised about William, that relevance requires constant reinvention. She left a fixed, inherited role and built something new, contemporary, and now industry recognised entirely on its own merits. That is reinvention in real time, while the institution she left is still being told publicly that it hasn't reinvented anything in a year. One more thing before I let you go. Notice how the entire premise of that panel was framed. Can William save the monarchy? As if the only two outcomes on the table are William succeeding or the whole thing collapsing. Nobody on mainstream British television is permitted to say the obvious part out loud. The two most globally beloved, most consistently reinvigorating people connected to that family are sitting in California, deliberately positioned outside the conversation by an institution that chose exile over evolution. So here's what I'm leaving you with today, family. Nobody on that panel said William is a bad person. What they said, in plain daytime television language, is that charm can't be manufactured, financial transparency can't be faked, and the kind of magic Diana had either lives in someone or it doesn't. Two commentators with very different politics landed on the exact same uncomfortable truth without meaning to. That magic didn't vanish. It just isn't standing in the building William's currently standing in. I want to hear from you on this one. Do you think this institution can even be saved at this point? And if it can, does it happen with William at the centre, or only if the firm finally makes peace with Harry and Meghan? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If this connected some dots for you today, hit like, send it to someone who still thinks this is just a family feud, and subscribe so you're here for the next one. Until next time, squaddies, stay loud, stay informed, and keep asking the questions the palace doesn't want asked. Take care of yourselves.